And we're back. It's time for another Good Vibes section. I'm Martin Falls, and joining us once again, the fabulous Debbie Cox-DeNova. Debbie, good to see you.
It's good to see you.
You just took a little trip, too.
I did. Bahamas.
I see the sun on the face.
See the sun. I swam with the piggies in the Bahamas.
How'd that go?
Amazing.
Well, we'll do a segment on that one. All right. So understanding trauma, bonding versus love.
Yeah. This is a
I
big
hope
one.
many people are tuning in.
I hope so too. And here's the thing to remember is that this conversation is not a replacement for any sort of actual therapy that you might need in this. And in some situations, if you're in a trauma bond, it can actually be very dangerous for you, even physically. Mm-hmm. So you want to make sure that you're not using this information to convince the other person of their emotional abuse. Sometimes with, especially with certain personality disorders, they already know they're doing wrong. They're never going to ever admit it. And so you're just banging your head against a wall. But the purpose of this is that I know that there are a lot of people who are looking for love out there. Mm-hmm. And because maybe they've been patterned or familiarized to a less than conscious way of communicating with other people, they find themselves in a cycle of abuse that they can't get out of, or that they have accidentally sort of associated with love. So I'd like to talk.
Become addicted to it, sort of?
Yeah, it's absolutely addictive. Okay. In fact, the cycle, there's two phases of trauma bonding. There's the abuse part, and then there's the honeymoon part. And so going back and forth between these two cycles can actually have you become very attached to your abuser.
They get weighed down, and then they want the honeymoon part where they feel revived.
They feel revived and they have hope, and they think, well, maybe he or she didn't really mean that, because it happens with, and it doesn't just happen.
Remember Urban Cowboy, looking for love in all the wrong places.
Exactly, and it doesn't just happen in romantic relationships. This can happen in the workplace. This can happen between friends. So really start to pay attention, because one of the big ways that you can actually make yourself unavailable for this cycle is to educate yourself on what you're looking for. A lot of people who are unaware of these dynamics find themselves in it, and then what ends up happening over time is that you blame yourself, and there is no shame whatsoever in being abused, emotionally abused, manipulated, lied to, okay? They blame themselves, and then they retreat into silence because they feel ashamed of actually sharing it with other people.
Now, we're always going to think, people watching are going to say, okay, I wonder what guy she's talking about abusing the woman, but can it be the opposite too?
Oh, it most certainly can, especially when we're talking about emotional abuse. So I'd like to go over the 5 signs of trauma bonding, but then I would like to actually highlight a little bit about emotional abuse, simply because that kind of abuse is less obvious. It goes unseen. It goes unacknowledged. And we know what physical abuse looks like. We know what sexual abuse looks like, right? People are much more likely to step in the way to protect somebody if they're being physically abused, right? That sets off red alerts. But the thing about emotional abuse is that it can actually be very invisible, and people are less likely to get involved. And the psychological scars are actually much more damaging in many cases, because you can heal from the physical stuff and move on, but the psychological stuff stays with you, and it actually makes you more likely to get into another emotionally abusive relationship. So we're not going to deep dive completely into emotional abuse, but I would like to talk about some signs and some common cycles of emotional abuse, so that if you are in a dynamic where you're feeling like someone is manipulating you or trying to control you using these tactics, that you have the education and you can start taking steps to get yourself out of
Or
this
if you feel like you're walking on eggshells.
If you feel like you're walking on eggshells. Oh, for sure. Because that is absolutely something that happens with this, is that you eventually find yourself going, wait a second, like, I don't want to actually be in this situation again. And we're actually going to go over the 4 cycles of emotional abuse. But let's talk about 5 signs that you might be in a trauma bond versus love, okay? The first one is that you are enmeshed. There aren't any healthy boundaries. So basically, you feel whatever the other person feels, you feel, right? You feel reluctant to actually do anything separate from that person. You feel like maybe you're prioritizing their needs above and beyond yours. It's just too much. Like, there aren't any healthy sort of lines between the two of you. We talked about it in a healthy relationship. There should be a good bit of independence and separation.
And trust.
And trust, right? But with enmeshment, it's like there's a blurring of like, I don't want to do anything without your opinion. I don't want to do anything without you. And whatever you're feeling, I'm feeling. So I have to make it better. Okay. Number two is that they have abused you before, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Like I said, we'll go over the emotional stuff. Even if they said they were sorry, this is just one sign. If they have abused you before, this is one sign that you might be in a trauma bond. Number three is that you're codependent. And in codependency, one person is an addict and they can be addicted to abuse of some sort. And the other person is helping the addict.
They're the enabler.
They're in the enabler, exactly. So they're there. And a lot of times people will build their identity around, well, I have to stay. This person needs me, right? And so it feels like if I leave, there's almost like my identity will fall apart. So they feel very much codependent on that person. Number four is that other person does not like to see you with friends or family. They might say, oh, they're not good enough for you, or they're not good for you. But at the end of the day, they're isolating you from your other community members so that they have control over the entire situation. So big red flag if someone is uncomfortable with or picks fights with you when you want to go see your friends, your family, or
so
you want to connect with them.
separation means they lose that control over you.
For sure. Yes.
Okay.
And then the fifth one is gaslighting. And people have heard about gaslighting, and they're constantly basically challenging your perception of reality. Well, it didn't happen like that, right? Or if I did anything to you, it's actually your fault. So it's an emotionally manipulating you into borrowing their perspective over, superimposing it over yours. And the problem with that is over time, you start to distrust your own perception and rely very heavily on their perception of reality instead, when it's basically just a manipulation.
Oh, this is so
tactic.
interesting. I bet a lot of people are peeking at TV right now or Facebook.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope
Yeah.
so. Yeah, it's really
'Cause
important.
It's good learning tool. All right, we'll take a short break. We'll be right back. Don't go away. Today's social media segment is brought to you by South Louisiana Bank. It's better when we bank together. Waits and Downer, attorneys at law. Terrebonne Ford, built Ford tough. Alford and Associates for all of your insurance needs. CIS, Cardiovascular Institute of the South, the highest quality cardiovascular care available. Barker Honda, the Barker family tradition of quality. Terrebonne General Health Systems, modern technology and timeless caring. Rouse's, you're either local or you're not. Buick, the craft of modern luxury. St. Martin and Bork, know your rights. All right, we are back with Debbie Cox DeNova, transformation coach. Very, very important subject today, and it's trauma bonding versus love. And, I bet a lot of times people have been in relationships 20, 30, 40 years. They probably never really stop to think about it. It's in the back of their head, but they never really go trauma bond or love.
Exactly. And a lot of people spend their entire lives only in trauma bonds. And so it's really important to recognize that if you're noticing signs of this, there is no shame in that. Like we talked about before, some of us just grew up with insecure attachment styles. So we learned patterns of communication that were kind of side door manipulation in order to get our needs and wants met. So if you find even that you are fine, and I've called myself out on before, I'm like, ooh, that's emotional manipulation, which is an abusive tactic, right? You really need to actually sit with like the only way for there to be change is for you to eat some humble pie and actually look at what's really there so that you can take steps to unpattern yourself from this, because it's really difficult. Now, in 1979, there was a psychologist, Lenore Walker, who came up with a social cycle theory, and it's called cycle of abuse, okay? So I really want you to pay attention at home and be honest with yourself. If you find yourself in a pattern that looks like this, and it doesn't matter if it's if you're a man, a woman, if it's a workplace thing or a relationship thing, then you are likely in in an abusive relationship, and you might be in a trauma bond if you're connected to them. The first part of it is called tension building. In tension building, the tension basically is increasing. There is a lack of communication sometimes. The victim starts to become fearful, maybe walking on eggshells. They can tell that the abuser is about to break in some way, shape, or form. Okay, so that this can be an area where like there's fights being picked or yelling starts to happen, right? This leads to an incident. Okay, so the incident can look like a number of different things. It can be a verbal attack. It can be a physical attack. It can be, abandonment, like, you know what, I'm out of here, stonewalling is an emotional abuse tactic. This is basically just removing all of your love from a person. Like your stonewalling is exactly as it sounds like. I'm not going to give you any feedback. I'm not talking to you. You don't exist to me anymore, right? Super contemptuous. There is, so it results in this sort of flare up in the relationship. And depending on the nature of the abuse, that's when the abuse happens, right? Following that is the reconciliation, because after the big explosion, the abuser is left in a vulnerable position because it's like, oh, this person could leave me, or they could go tell other people about what just happened. And so they come to the table humble.
I'm going to lose my power.
Exactly. And this is the reconciliation phase where they may apologize, and sometimes they're sincere, sometimes they are not. They give excuses. Sometimes they'll blame the victim. This really is, at the end of the day, if you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't have done that, right? They deny that the abuse even occurred, right? But whatever they're doing, they're trying to bridge back together. So there's a breach, right? There's a rupture. And we have talked about rupture and repair. This is not a true repair. So there's a rupture process, and the person is trying to get back into relationship with the person without really truly owning responsibility. Okay. So sometimes they'll even apologize, but there's no actual steps to changing behavior. It's going to happen again, basically.
Right.
After reconciliation, and this is what draws a lot of people back into the cycle, is a season of calm. And this is they call it the honeymoon phase, okay? So in the very beginning of a relationship, in a toxic relationship, oftentimes there's something called love bombing, okay? That's where they're using attention, affection, adoration, sort of pouring it out on you in order to get you in, okay? And people can be very confused by this. It feels so good. It feels easy. It feels magnetizing. This is my person forever. During the honeymoon phase is where that love bombing comes back in. So it's like there's gifts. There is, beautiful words of affirmation. Maybe the only season in the cycle where you actually hear kind things during this time. This is the part where people look back and go, but he's so nice. But during that, he's such a good person at some times. Or she's actually really cool during certain seasons. That's this. Now, one emotional abuse.
So they're negotiating with themselves.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. To stay in, right? But then it goes back in attention building, back into incident reconciliation, and then back to the calm. So the calm kind of keeps it there in that honeymoon stage. Now, this is something that you should know. It's called DARVO. So DARVO is a psychological manipulation tactic. And what it stands for is deny responsibility, okay, attack, and then reverse the roles between the victim and the offender. Okay, so there's 3 steps. Deny responsibility, like, oh, you know what, I didn't really do anything wrong. Flip it and attack on you, like, what's wrong with you right now? Like, are you crazy? Like, what? Why are you? Actually, I'm kind of offended that you're even bringing this up. And then reverse roles is where, wow, you know what? I'm really sick and tired of you doing this to me all the time, like bringing up all of this stuff. So now the victim finds themselves in a confused state going, wait a second. And oftentimes the victim will be apologizing to the abuser when the abuser doesn't ever take responsibility in these things. It's a very, very toxic cycle that is not love. And so love feels safe. Love feels connected. Love makes you feel like there's a consistency. That's another thing. There's a lot of inconsistency in this. It's like, I tell you one thing, but then I'm doing another thing.
So it sounds like the abuser has mastered the pattern.
For sure. They're in control. It feels very, very chaotic to the abused, but there's a controlled pattern that happens in these situations. And the important thing is that you get out, document what's happening so that you can reinforce your hold on reality, like really take pictures of communications, and then don't use that to try to be right or to try to convince them. Get yourself to a safe place, connect to a community of people who actually will help support you, and bring yourself to a trauma-informed therapist so that you can break the cycle within yourself.
All right. Very interesting. Yeah, for sure. Thank you, Deb.
You're
Appreciate
welcome.
it. All right. We'll be back next time around for another very interesting topic on Good Vibes.